They say never back a wild animal into a corner. They forget something worse. Never corner a single mother quietly cleaning up your trash. The steel wrench clattered against the concrete. He smirked at my face, thinking he had trapped a broken woman. He had no idea that beneath this frayed jacket were thousands of hours of lethal training in a ghost unit. He wanted me to kneel. I gave him exactly 9 seconds to regret being born. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep things running, which means we are forced to pause all new uploads here for the foreseeable future. However, we are moving our operations over to Patreon, so if you enjoyed today's story and want to support us, please consider joining our Patreon community. Over there, you will get access to exclusive, true stories that are much longer, packed with raw details. We simply cannot publish on YouTube, and brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in a single episode. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link pinned in the comments and the description box below. Now, let us dive right into today's story, where my name is Elisa Shepherd. The air inside the historic restoration garage on the Charleston coast tasted like rusted iron, stale gasoline, and salt. It was thick, suffocating, and dripping with the kind of brutal southern humidity that makes your clothes stick right to your spine. But the heat expanding inside my chest was burning infinitely hotter. A loud, metallic crash echoed off the exposed brick walls as my heavy steel toolbox went flying across the cracked concrete floor. Sockets, ratchets, and wrenches scattered in every direction, disappearing under the rusted chassis of a half-restored classic muscle car. Standing over the mess was Trent, my oversized stepbrother. He was completely shirtless, proudly displaying a crowded canvas of cheap, faded tribal tattoos that stretched across his chest and thick arms. He was sweating cheap alcohol from the night before, flanked by 3 of his low-life friends who were leaning against the expensive customer cars, laughing like hyenas at a fresh kill. "Clean it up, you pathetic leech," Trent roared, his deep voice bouncing off the corrugated tin roof. He stepped closer, aggressively kicking a rogue spark plug in my direction. "You are nothing but a weak single mom, living off my family's generosity. Look at you. You are an absolute joke." I did not say a single word. I just kept my head angled down, staring at the oil stains on my boots, letting him believe he held all the cards. I had spent the last several weeks perfecting the art of being invisible, swallowing my pride, and hiding my instincts to protect the one thing that mattered in my life. But then, Trent made the ultimate, unforgivable mistake. He grew bored of screaming at a passive wall and turned his attention to the back corner of the shop. My 14-year-old son, Leo, was sitting on an overturned plastic milk crate, quietly trying to fix the broken chain on his bicycle. The boy had been trying to make himself as small as physically possible, terrified of the loud noises and the aggressive, unpredictable men invading our only safe space. Trent marched over, intentionally using his massive 6'3" frame to completely block the open roll-up door, cutting off the only source of natural light and the only exit. He cornered Leo against the cold cinder block wall. He did not touch him, because the coward knew better than to leave a physical mark, but he leaned down, trapping my son in his looming shadow, radiating pure, suffocating intimidation. "Drop the wrench, kid," Trent snarled, his face just inches from Leo's trembling shoulders. "I am sick of hearing that annoying clicking sound. Put it down right now before I drag it out and throw it in the ocean." Leo scrambled backward, his narrow shoulders hitting the hard wall with a dull thud. His small hands were shaking so badly that the tool slipped from his greasy fingers, clattering loudly onto the floor. Wide, panicked eyes darted through the dim light toward me, silently begging for his mother to save him. That was the exact fraction of a second the exhausted, battered single-mother persona permanently died. I stood exactly 3 steps away. The salty coastal breeze whipped through the open bay doors, tossing my loose hair across my face, but my eyes were dead, black, and completely locked onto the pulsating Adam's apple at the base of Trent's thick throat. Slowly, deliberately, I began peeling off my heavy, oil-stained mechanic gloves, one finger at a time. The rough canvas peeled away, exposing knuckles that had been fractured, shattered, and rebuilt more times than I could ever count. My heart rate instantly dropped. My breathing shifted into a rhythmic, shallow cadence. The chaotic world around me slowed down to an agonizing crawl. The smell of the ocean and the exhaust fumes faded entirely, replaced by the sterile, cold metallic scent of impending violence. I was no longer a struggling mechanic trying to make ends meet. I was reactivating a dormant, highly lethal combat state, ingrained deep in my DNA by the Outer Tactical Operations, or OTO, an intelligence agency that did not exist on any government payroll, budget, or public record. They trained us to be ghosts, to dismantle extreme threats with zero hesitation and maximum prejudice. For years, I was their sharpest scalpel. Trent laughed, turning his head slightly to look back at me, completely unaware that he had just crossed an invisible tripwire. He genuinely thought he was bullying a helpless, defeated woman. He was actually standing squarely in the middle of a designated kill zone. But to understand how a top-tier covert operative ended up covered in motor oil, quietly taking abuse from a third-rate club bouncer in a rundown garage, we have to pause and rewind the clock. Exactly 6 months ago, everything I knew and loved was violently ripped away, forcing me into the shadows. 6 months ago, the ocean breeze rolling off the harbor did not carry the bitter scent of greed. It smelled of worn leather, fresh paint, and the comforting pipe tobacco my father used to smoke. When a sudden, massive heart attack took him from us, it shattered my world. He left behind a prime piece of waterfront real estate, a historic automotive restoration shop that had been in our family for 3 generations, but before the dirt on his grave had even settled, the vultures descended. Valerie, my father's estranged, ruthless businesswoman of a wife, swept into the shop like a hurricane dressed in high-end designer silk. She did not shed a single tear. Instead, she slapped a stack of heavily notarized, entirely forged power of attorney documents onto my father's old oak desk. "Pack your bags, sweetie," Valerie had said, her lips painted a severe, blood red. "This property is moving on to bigger and better things, and you are no longer part of the equation." She had already brokered a massive, multi-million-dollar backdoor deal to sell the entire lot to a corporate real estate conglomerate. They planned to bulldoze my father's legacy to build sterile, towering luxury condominiums. Within 48 hours, Valerie formally evicted Leo and me from the comfortable apartment above the main garage. She forced us out into the scrapyard behind the shop, banishing us to a rusted, gutted Airstream trailer that lacked running water and barely had working electricity. While Valerie paraded around the property in thousands of dollars worth of jewelry, I was boiling water on a camping stove just so my son could wash his face before school. The contrast was a sharp, daily humiliation. Then came her son, Trent. Valerie appointed him as the supposed head of private security for the property. In reality, he was a washed-up nightclub bouncer who used the title to act like a warlord. Night after night, Trent brought his loud, obnoxious friends to the shop. They drank cheap beer, blasted terrible music, and intentionally smashed my father's antique tools and vintage car memorabilia just to watch the glass break. I watched it all happen through the tiny, cracked window of our Airstream. Every fiber of my being, every lethal instinct forged in the black sights of my past, screamed at me to step out into the dark and break his jaw in 3 places. But I swallowed the bile in my throat and stayed put. I did not cower because I was afraid. I submitted because I was a ghost. When I left the agency, the organization buried my true identity under layers of encrypted federal firewalls to protect me from the international syndicates I had dismantled. I chose this quiet, grueling life of poverty because it was the only way to guarantee Leo would grow up in a normal world, far away from the blood, the gunfire, and the shadows. Exposing my skills meant exposing us to enemies far worse than a petty stepbrother. So, I played the part of the broken, defeated single mother. I cleaned up their messes, kept my head bowed, and endured the humiliation to keep my son safe. But my ironclad patience ran out on a humid Tuesday night at 2 o'clock in the morning. I had crept into the main office to mop up a puddle of spilled whiskey and broken glass left behind by one of Trent's chaotic parties. As I swept near my father's desk, I noticed a thick leather-bound folder tucked carelessly underneath a discarded pizza box. Valerie had clearly been working out of the office earlier that day and left her private files exposed. Curiosity was a dangerous habit for a retired intelligence operative. I wiped my hands on my jeans, opened the folder, and began scanning the dense financial spreadsheets. It only took my trained eyes 10 seconds to realize the scope of what I was holding. Valerie was not just stealing my father's land. She was running a highly sophisticated, deeply illegal financial operation. Scattered among the real estate proposals were dozens of black market credit applications and massive offshore loan agreements. But the signature at the bottom of these multi-million-dollar debts did not belong to Valerie. It was my name, my social security number, my forged signature. Valerie was systematically taking out colossal, high-interest loans from violent underground syndicates, funneling the clean cash into her own hidden accounts, and leaving me as the sole legal guarantor. When the time came to pay the piper, the cartels would not come looking for her. They would come looking for the weak, disposable single mother living in the scrapyard. She was not just robbing me of my inheritance. She was sentencing my son and me to death to wash dirty money for the criminal underworld. Standing alone in the dark office, holding the undeniable proof of our impending execution, the facade of the quiet mechanic completely dissolved. Valerie thought she was setting up a naive victim. She did not know she had just handed a loaded weapon to a dormant apex predator. The following weekend, the hostility escalated from passive aggression to a loud, obnoxious display of fake power. Valerie decided to host an extravagant barbecue right on the front concrete apron of the historic garage, purely to entertain a dozen prospective corporate real estate investors. They hauled in massive commercial grills that smoked up the entire yard, hired private caterers in crisp white uniforms, and set up towering audio speakers that blasted deafening bass music late into the evening. The heavy vibrations rattled the thin, rusted aluminum walls of our trailer, making it absolutely impossible for Leo to get even 1 hour of sleep before his final school exams. During the daylight hours, I played my assigned role to absolute perfection. I was the silent, hunched figure lingering in the background. I hauled 50-pound bags of garbage, wiped down greasy outdoor tables, and completely ignored the condescending sneers from Valerie and her wealthy, champagne-sipping guests. They looked at me as if I were a wild stray dog rummaging through their leftover scraps, an ugly blemish on their multi-million-dollar business deal. But when midnight finally struck and the drunken laughter faded into the distance, the stray dog vanished. Inside the suffocating, humid air of the trailer, while Leo slept soundly with heavy foam earplugs tightly secured, I pulled a reinforced, waterproof steel case from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner, and the locks hissed open. Inside was not a set of standard mechanic tools, but a military-grade quantum processing unit, unregistered and completely untraceable by standard government oversight. I booted up the multi-tiered encrypted operating system, my fingers flying across the glowing keyboard with muscle memory that had never truly faded. I did not need to hire a high-priced, arrogant lawyer to fight Valerie and her fraudulent paperwork. The traditional justice system was far too slow, too blind, and too easily bought for the kind of absolute vengeance I was preparing. Instead, I quietly slipped into the dark web, effortlessly bypassing banking security protocols I had actively helped design a decade ago. It took me less than 45 minutes to locate the massive underground loan profiles Valerie had taken out using my stolen identity. She had borrowed over $3 million from a notorious South American cartel syndicate. I did not cancel the transactions. That would be far too merciful. Instead, I carefully rerouted the digital destination of the borrowed funds. I linked the cartel's aggressive payback accounts directly to Valerie's personal offshore shell companies, weaving a highly complex web of automated financial triggers. When the time was perfectly right, One single keystroke would detonate a devastating digital time bomb. It would make it look exactly as if Valerie had brazenly stolen millions of dollars directly from the most violent criminals on the continent. I was not just building a case, I was weaving a noose. The sun rose at 6 o'clock the next morning, painting the harbor in harsh streaks of orange light. I was already outside in the scrapyard, quietly sorting through a heavy pile of salvaged alternators. Suddenly, the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the morning calm. A brand-new, cherry-red Porsche sports car tore through the gravel driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of gray dust and sharp debris. Trent was behind the wheel, burning expensive rubber with zero regard for his surroundings. He had clearly purchased the luxury vehicle using a massive chunk of the black market cash his mother had siphoned from the fraudulent loans. He swerved violently into the scrapyard, the heavy tires skidding and halting just 2 inches away from Leo's carefully stacked school projects and his fragile bicycle parts. Trent revved the engine loudly, laughing as the dual exhaust spat noxious, burning fumes directly into my workspace. Normally, I would have taken a step back, lowered my eyes to the dirt, and quickly gathered my son's belongings to get them out of his path. But the game had fundamentally changed. The digital trap was armed. The safety switch was permanently off. For the first time in 6 agonizing months, I did not bow my head. I dropped the heavy metal alternator into the dirt and stepped directly in front of the blinding headlights of his $200,000 machine. I stood completely still. I locked my eyes onto Trent through the expensive tinted windshield. I did not glare, and I did not look angry. I simply looked at him the way a seasoned mortician looks at a fresh corpse on a stainless steel table. It was a hollow, dead stare forged in the absolute certainty of his impending destruction. Even through the thick glass, I saw his smug, arrogant smile instantly falter. The sudden shift in my posture caught him entirely off guard. A sharp, inexplicable chill visibly ran down his spine, forcing him to shift uncomfortably in his plush leather seat. He did not understand why a greasy, exhausted mechanic in a tattered flannel shirt was suddenly making his primal survival instincts scream in raw terror, desperate to regain his fragile ego, especially since his loud friends were pulling up behind him in a heavily lifted truck. Trent slammed his car door open and stepped out into the dirt. "Are you completely deaf, you stupid woman?" he barked, though his voice noticeably lacked its usual booming confidence. "Move your pathetic garbage out of my parking spot right now before I run it over, and you along with it." I remained absolutely silent, maintaining that same chilling, unblinking eye contact. "You think you can just stare at me like that in my own property?" he shouted, taking a heavy step forward, desperately trying to mask his sudden unease with loud, performative aggression. "You and your weak kid are absolutely nothing. I run this place now." When I still refused to flinch, he scoffed, turning away and marching aggressively toward the main garage, throwing loud insults over his broad shoulders to impress his arriving buddies. He was puffing his chest, loudly planting the seeds for a final, physical confrontation to prove his dominance to his peers. He thought he was walking into the shop to assert his authority over my son. He was actually walking completely blindfolded straight into a slaughterhouse. "Look at this pathetic trash," Trent sneered, projecting his deep voice so the group of wealthy real estate investors touring the main bay could hear him clearly. Valerie was standing a few yards away, dressed in a crisp white pantsuit, delicately sipping champagne from an expensive crystal flute. She wore a smug, deeply satisfied smile, thoroughly enjoying the sight of her stepdaughter and grandson being publicly humiliated. The wealthy executives paused their polite conversations, their eyes fixed on us with a morbid, detached fascination, like wealthy tourists watching a caged animal being prodded with a stick. "You are absolutely nothing," Trent continued, turning his massive frame entirely away from Leo to face me directly. "Just a useless, broken woman taking up my valuable space. Come over here and pick up this wrench, you absolute waste of life." I did not look at the wrench. I simply took one measured, silent step forward, positioning myself directly between his towering frame and my terrified son. "Move away from my boy," I said. My voice was not loud, nor was it shaking with the fear he expected. It was a flat, dead, metallic frequency. That cold, absolute defiance was the ultimate insult to his fragile ego, especially in front of his mother and her millionaire associates. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. With a primal, aggressive grunt, Trent lunged forward. He threw his entire 200-pound weight into a devastating, wide right hook aimed squarely at the side of my head. It was a brutal street brawler's punch, heavy, wildly telegraphed, and designed to completely crush bone upon impact. The tactical clock in my mind instantly started. I had 9 seconds to completely dismantle his physical framework. Second one, I did not flinch, I did not block, and I did not retreat a single inch. Instead, I stepped diagonally forward, slipping precisely inside the wide, looping arc of his massive swinging fist. The raw kinetic energy of his strike passed harmlessly over my left shoulder, displacing the heavy, humid coastal air right next to my ear. Second two, with his violent momentum fully committed and his heavy arm extended blindly past my head, his right flank was completely exposed and structurally compromised. I brought my left hand up in a blur, my fingers wrapping tightly around his thick, sweaty wrist like a cold titanium vise. Second three, I pivoted my hips sharply on the ball of my foot, instantly hijacking his massive forward momentum. I did not need to match his brute, muscular strength. I simply used his own aggressive velocity against him, forcefully twisting his extended arm into an unnatural, agonizing angle that instantly locked his elbow joint. Second four, the human body is just a fragile architectural structure, highly dependent on specific load-bearing joints to maintain balance. With his upper body violently torquing forward, I drove the hardened rubber heel of my right combat boot forward in a vicious, calculated, linear stomp. Second five, the crushing impact struck the exact center of his right knee, targeting the highly sensitive peroneal nerve and the delicate, vulnerable patellar tendon. The heavy joint completely gave way with a sickening, wet, popping sound that echoed sharply like a gunshot off the exposed brick walls. Second six, Trent's massive frame instantly collapsed inward. The structural foundation of his right leg was utterly destroyed, dropping his heavy upper body downward as gravity aggressively and mercilessly took over. Second seven, I maintained absolute, unyielding control of his trapped right arm as he fell, sharply rotating his thick wrist backward into a high-level neurological compliance lock. I had perfected over thousands of hours in the black sites of the outer tactical operations. The brutal, spiraling torque locked his shoulder socket in place, paralyzing his entire central nervous system with blinding, white-hot pain. Second eight, he slammed face first onto the hard concrete floor, crashing directly into a thick black puddle of stagnant motor oil. The heavy impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. Second nine, I applied exactly 1 final millimeter of upward, snapping pressure to his bent wrist. Trent let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream that tore violently through the open garage, completely shattering the tense silence of the room. He thrashed weakly in the dark, slippery sludge, coughing on the toxic exhaust fumes, utterly immobilized, broken, and deeply humiliated. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed was absolute. Dozens of high-end smartphones, previously held by the wealthy investors to casually record the garage's classic restored cars, were now aimed squarely at the violent, shocking spectacle. The rich executives were frozen in pure, unadulterated shock, their expensive champagne flutes trembling uncontrollably in their manicured hands. Valerie's smug, victorious smile had completely vanished, instantly replaced by a pale, breathless mask of pure horror as she watched her supposedly invincible son sobbing uncontrollably in a filthy pool of grease. I held the brutal joint lock for exactly 1 more heartbeat, letting the cold reality of his physical destruction fully sink into his broken, arrogant mind. Then, with casual indifference, I smoothly released my tight grip. I stood up slowly, deliberately slowing my heart rate back down to a normal, steady resting rhythm. I lightly brushed a small speck of dust off the sleeve of my frayed canvas jacket, keeping my posture entirely relaxed and non-threatening. I slowly turned my head toward the crowd of terrified, silent, wealthy onlookers. I locked eyes directly with a particularly pale executive clutching his recording phone. "He tripped," I said, my voice completely smooth and dangerously calm in the silent room. "Right?" The dead silence that smothered the extravagant barbecue was thick enough to cut with a rusted knife. For a group of individuals who prided themselves on commanding boardrooms and closing multi-million-dollar deals, these wealthy investors suddenly looked like terrified children. The illusion of their sophisticated superiority vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by the primal fear of raw, unpolished reality. Valerie broke the frozen tableau. With a shrill, completely unhinged shriek, she violently hurled her expensive crystal champagne flute onto the concrete. It shattered into 100 sparkling pieces. She frantically clawed at her designer handbag, pulling out her phone and dialing 911 with wildly trembling fingers. "Police! Get the police here right this instant!" Valerie screamed, her carefully curated persona of a poised, high society matriarch completely crumbling. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her face contorted in absolute rage. "I want her arrested. Arrest this dangerous lunatic for intentional, aggravated assault. She just tried to murder my son." Within exactly 4 minutes, the wailing sirens of 2 local police cruisers pierced the coastal air. They came tearing down the driveway, completely ignoring the gravel as their tires screeched to a halt right next to the catered buffet tables. 4 heavily armed officers stepped out, led by a broad-shouldered police captain who carried himself with the bloated, arrogant swagger of a man entirely used to bullying the local working class. Trent, still entirely grounded in the puddle of black grease, weakly raised a shaking, oil-covered hand to point directly at me. He was whimpering softly, a stark, pathetic contrast to the massive, heavily tattooed tough guy he pretended to be just 10 minutes prior. Valerie immediately marched up to the police captain, completely invading his personal space. She did not ask for assistance. She demanded obedience, in a loud theatrical voice designed to impress her wealthy audience. She began aggressively dropping the names of the district attorney, the local mayor, and at least 3 prominent city council members. She made sure the captain knew exactly who funded his precinct's annual charity gala, heavily implying that his shiny brass badge was entirely dependent on her immediate satisfaction. "Put her in chains right now," Valerie ordered, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "She is a violent, unstable squatter, and I want her locked in a dark cell for the next 20 years. The captain, eager to please a woman holding the purse strings of local politics, puffed out his chest and marched purposefully in my direction. He unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt, his face set in a stern, authoritative scowl. He expected me to cry, to beg for mercy, or to nervously try and explain myself like a typical frightened civilian. I did none of those things. I simply stood completely still, my hands resting casually by my sides, as the loud, aggressive captain stepped into my personal space and reached out to grab my left wrist. I deliberately shifted my arm just enough to let the frayed canvas cuff of my jacket slide up. Exposed against my pale skin, just below the crease of my wrist, was a very specific, stark black barcode tattoo. It was not a random design. It was the classified biometric identification marker of the Outer Tactical Operations. To a normal street cop, it meant absolutely nothing. But to a precinct captain who had undergone advanced federal database clearance training, it was the equivalent of staring directly into the barrel of a loaded tactical shotgun. The physical transformation of the arrogant police captain was absolutely comical. The moment his eyes locked onto that barcode, all the color violently drained from his face. His authoritative scowl instantly collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He abruptly stopped breathing. His hand, which was mere inches from grabbing my arm, froze entirely in midair before slowly, carefully pulling back as if he had almost touched a live explosive wire. The captain swallowed hard, an audible gulp in the tense silence. He instinctively took 2 large steps backward, creating a vast, respectful distance between us. When he turned his head to look at Valerie, his eyes were wide and filled with panic. "Ma'am," the captain said, his voice completely stripped of its previous arrogance, now cracking with noticeable strain. This woman has done absolutely nothing wrong. The only person committing a crime here is the man lying in the oil, aggressively disturbing the peace and threatening a minor. Valerie's jaw dropped open. She looked at the captain as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she shrieked, her face turning a bright, angry purple. "I just told you she assaulted him. Arrest her immediately." "I strongly suggest you lower your voice and step back, ma'am," the captain interrupted, his tone now cold, frantic, and deeply serious. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Valerie. "If you continue to file false police reports and waste city resources, I will personally place you under arrest for public endangerment and obstruction of justice." A collective, shocked murmur rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors. The illusions of power were shattering right in front of their eyes. They began instinctively shuffling backward, subtly moving toward their expensive imported cars. These were people who survived on corporate instinct, and their instincts were suddenly screaming that they were dangerously close to something highly classified and entirely untouchable. Valerie stood frozen in absolute disbelief. For the very first time in her privileged, sheltered life, she realized that all her money, all her fake political connections, and all her arrogant posturing meant absolutely nothing. She slowly turned her head to look at me. The weak, defeated stepdaughter she had spent 6 months stomping on was entirely gone. In my place stood an untouchable phantom, a ghost backed by a terrifying, invisible authority she could not even begin to comprehend. Without speaking a single word, the police captain forcefully ordered his deputies to drag a sobbing, humiliated Trent up from the oily floor, with her entire world suddenly tilting off its axis. Valerie had no choice but to grab her ruined designer bag, turn her back, and retreat into the main house like a beaten, terrified dog, dragging her broken son along with her. By Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Valerie decided to launch her final, desperate strike. Knowing her local political shield had completely shattered over the weekend, she scrambled to salvage her fraudulent empire. She gathered the corporate real estate lawyers in my father's old office, intent on signing the expedited sale contract. Her plan was simple and cowardly. She was going to liquidate the historic property, take the massive payout, and immediately flee across state lines, leaving the millions of dollars in black market syndicate debt squarely on my shoulders. I watched through the cracked window of the Airstream as she smugly uncapped her expensive. The exact second the gold NIB of her pen touched the thick parchment paper, the digital tripwire I had meticulously coded 72 hours prior was instantly triggered. Deep within the encrypted servers of the global financial network, a catastrophic chain reaction occurred. Every single offshore bank account Valerie had secretly opened to hide her stolen wealth was simultaneously frozen, drained, and permanently locked. The $3 million of dirty money she had borrowed under my name did not just vanish. My automated protocol successfully routed every single penny directly into the heavily monitored, aggressive collection accounts of the South American cartel she thought she was outsmarting. In the span of a single breath, the system framed her perfectly. To the federal government, she was a massive money launderer. To the criminal underworld, she was a brazen thief who just stole millions from a ruthless syndicate. Before Valerie could even finish signing her last name, the deafening sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed across the property. The heavy wooden doors of the main office were violently kicked off their iron hinges. Over 3 dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear, bearing the insignia of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, swarmed into the garage. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision, aiming laser sights directly at the chests of the screaming corporate lawyers and a highly confused Valerie. "Federal agents! Nobody move a single muscle!" the lead commander roared, his voice cutting through the panic. Valerie dropped her gold pen, raising her manicured hands into the air, her face completely drained of blood. She frantically tried to explain that there was a massive mistake, that she was a respected businesswoman, But her own smartphone betrayed her. It began vibrating violently on the desk, flooded with automated banking alerts showing a zero balance, followed immediately by terrifying, encrypted text messages from cartel enforcers promising immediate and violent retaliation for the stolen funds. The trap had closed entirely. There was no political favor expensive enough to save her from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the international cartel simultaneously. Outside in the main bay, the federal agents dragged Trent out from the front seat of his unpaid luxury sports car. The towering, heavily tattooed enforcer, who loved to terrorize women and children, completely broke down. He fell to his knees in the dirt, sobbing hysterically like an infant, pleading with the heavily armed officers that he knew absolutely nothing about his mother's illegal operations. His entire fake, tough guy persona crumbled into pathetic, begging dust. Valerie was aggressively shoved out of the office, heavy steel handcuffs biting deeply into her wrists. As the agents marched her toward the armored federal transport vehicles, her frantic, terrified eyes locked onto mine. I was standing quietly on the edge of the scrapyard, my hands resting in the pockets of my worn canvas jacket. In that final, silent exchange, she saw the absolute truth. She finally realized that I had engineered her total, inescapable annihilation without ever raising my voice. Her eyes widened in pure, suffocating despair right before the heavy metal doors of the transport van slammed shut, swallowing her into the darkness forever. As the chaotic scene slowly began to clear, the lead federal commander, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp jawline, walked quietly over to where I was standing. He did not ask for my identification. He simply stopped 2 feet away, looked me directly in the eyes, and gave a slow, subtle nod of deep respect. It was the silent, unspoken greeting of a fellow ghost, a former comrade from the outer tactical operations recognizing a flawless, bloodless strike without saying a single word. He reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and placed it gently onto the hood of a nearby car before turning and walking away. Inside the envelope were the fully authenticated, legally unassailable property deeds to the entire historic garage. The property was completely clean, free of all debts, and legally transferred exclusively into the name of my 14-year-old son, Leo. Late that afternoon, a warm, golden sunset washed over the Charleston coast. The air no longer smelled of toxic exhaust or burning rage. It smelled of fresh salt, old wood, and absolute peace. I sat comfortably on the polished hood of a classic 1968 muscle car, a cold bottle of craft beer in my hand. I took a slow, refreshing sip, a genuine smile crossing my face as I watched Leo. He was happily sitting on his overturned milk crate in the center of the clean, quiet garage, meticulously turning a wrench to fix the chain on his bicycle. He was safe. The war was officially over, fought without a single bullet, but brutally decisive nonetheless. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. As a reminder, if you found today's story engaging, please know that YouTube has entirely demonetized our channel, so we will no longer be uploading new videos here in the near future. We are moving all our operations to Patreon. Please help us keep these stories alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. Over there, you can listen to our absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you there.